this computer. Okay, hold on, let me make sure that it is recording. Okay, all right, we're good, we're good. Okay, so here we go. Starting again, this is a lecture on two lectures together, one on gender and nation and one on critiques of Western feminism. So today we'll be talking about concepts of the relationship, the intertwinement of nation and gender, and then we'll be talking about Mohanty's argument about, not argument, but theory of cartographies of struggle. And when Mohanty uses the word cartography, I think that she's making an argument about how struggles can be mapped around the world and that they are different if you map it around the world. So the word cartography means mapping. So it's like mapping different struggles through the perspective of what Mohanty would call third world women, okay? So it's not just about, the focus is no longer just on women, right, but on third world, okay? So we're looking at different ways that regional politics become linked to politics of gender, okay? And then lastly, we're going to talk about subalternity, just a little bit, okay? And Spivak's argument and kind of important essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? Now, the idea of subaltern then is a kind of notion that, oh, you know, subaltern is a subjectless individual who cannot speak, okay? And what makes it? So subaltern means you're like if there's a totem pole of whether that's intersectional oppression or whatever, subaltern means that you're lowest on that totem pole in every single way. So if there's any forms of oppression that can be put upon you, and actually that kind of makes you into a subject, right, by all these kind of these oppressive forces. And Spivak uses the example of women in India, and I'll go into that, or specifically widows in India, but I'll go into that later. The idea is that the subaltern is that low, right, that is at the bottom of the totem pole of all hierarchies. But at the same time, right, what Spivak is saying is that subaltern, because they are stripped of all the kind of, not stripped, but not endowed with all the privileges that being a subject of a nation, being a subject, you know, who can speak a language or is even gendered in a kind of privileging way, that those who are in that subaltern category, by definition, they're so subaltern that they cannot speak at all. And yet, that means that if they cannot speak, they still need to be spoken for, right? So this issue is kind of a major critique of feminism, but also kind of the critique of no subject in critical theory from the continental tradition. Okay, so I will try to go over all three of those things, okay? Is everyone still with me? All right, cool, let's go. Okay, all right, so the first thing then we had to think about is nationalism. So now, how can it be that some places nation is seen as something that can be like in your blood, right? You're ethnic, right? But then in other places like Australia or United States or India, even constitutionally anyway, the nation is constituted of people who imagine themselves to be together. And that is kind of its foundational principle. It's that nation is not necessarily a thing. There's no such thing as a nation. Nation itself, nation itself is a sort of concept that is created, and we belong to a nation because we imagine ourselves as part of that community. So what that means, right? Like, let's say before you were a nation, you lived in this kind of town, and you didn't really understand yourself as part of one larger group. You might have thought of yourself as like, oh, you know, I live in this town. You're like a townsperson, right? Or something like that, right? But at the same time, there's no necessarily an organizing principle that kind of is overarching above you. Unless, right, you are part of like a feudal system where I am a, you know, I belong to this noble. This noble handles me, takes care of me. Or, you know, part of a religious group, right? Like I am a Christian, I am a Hindu, I am Muslim, right? And I get my kind of overarching directives that are not immediately local to me, okay? That doesn't interact with me on a regular basis. I get that from this other organizing principle. If you think about it as nation, as religion, then nation is also very similar in that you will never ever meet the people of your nation, right? You will meet people that you are with locally, right? But you have to imagine oneself as linked in some way to someone who lives 600, 700 miles away from you, or obviously further, right? And maybe, but what links you together is you both share participation in this thing called nationhood. So Benedict Anderson talks about this and calls it an imagined community. So nations are imagined communities, and they're sort of what's it called? Reproduced by media. And specifically, he talks about like print media, but a lot of people talk about how the conception of nationhood happens in many different ways. Like in my work, I talk about the conception of Chineseness as a sort of fake, not fake, but a sort of slippery way to define nation, because Chinese is always linked to ethnicity, right? And it's always linked to language. And yet they're trying to make China, like many people who are in power are trying to make Chinese be an ethnicity, but also be a nation, right? And so, and also be a language, right? And by playing all three, then it kind of constructs this, okay? So the point about nation then is that if it's a construction that's constructed through media and that kind of thing, right? And this makes, okay, this is linked to a lot of other post-colonial discourses, okay? So I'll just stop there. But the nation is not necessarily like a real thing. It's something that you imagine yourself as being together with other people and going through similar things. But the things that you go through that are similarity is dispersed to you and able to be dispersed to you because of media, okay? All right, so one of the critiques then of nationalism as what I wrote here as a discursive community. So discursive means discourse, right? So it's something that's talked about and created through discourse. Okay, so nation as a discursive community, or one of the critiques of that is that when we talk about that discourse, there's not enough attention paid to the role of gender in that imagination and as an invention of political community, right? So this is key. It's like, you know, you are part of a political community because there's a discourse that says that you belong together and you share in this experience of reading that discourse and engaging in it. Okay, so nationhood is made by people who think of themselves as part of that imagined community. But the critique is not enough people talk about the role that gender plays in that imagination of community. Okay, all right, so this is where our decolonizing gender kind of critique comes in, right? So this is what McClintock, in a very important essay she writes, and also kind of a lot of her work. She wrote a really great book called Imperial Leather. I think I posted that on Moodle, so you should check it out, right? But this is the argument. All nationalisms are gendered, all are invented, and all are dangerous, in the sense of representing relations to political power and to the technologies of violence, okay? Yes, nationalism, very important to understand, okay? Despite nationalism's ideological investment in the idea of popular unity, nations have historically amounted to the sanctioned institutionalization of gender difference. No nation in the world gives women and men the same access to the rights and resources of the nation state. Rather than expressing the flowering into time of the organic essence of a timeless people, nations are contested systems of cultural representation that limit and legitimize people's access to the resources of the nation state. Okay, so the investment, and she's calling it an ideological investment, right? This kind of belief that you are part of that imagined community is about this idea that we're all the same. We're all united. All Americans are Americans, right? Because we believe in this ideological credo, like all men are created equal. But at the same time, already it's imbued with a gender difference, right? You know, and when it comes to like, obviously American nationalism, all men only included men who could vote. And that means then that, you know, only white men who had property and not women, right? So there's already difference created into that nationhood, even though the ideology is one of unity. Like we should all work together, but then you have gender difference already built into that togetherness, right? And that's part of how nationhood works, right? Okay, so another thing that's very important that McClintock points out is that gender, specifically the norms of gendered knowledge, are used to imagine the stakes of political contestation between groups. Okay, so women, because of the way that knowledge is gendered, women end up symbolizing power between men. Okay, so one very obvious example would be like, let's say we have a tribe, okay, and there's another tribe across, right? And you know, we think about like what makes this tribe more competitive than that tribe, and what makes it so that we agree with each other on things, right? So, you know, yes, there's competition over resources, but there's also this kind of issue of how do I know that I have authority over you and you have authority over me? And a lot of it is seen as a competition over resources. And one of those resources, which is really not a resource, right, is this idea of access to women. Okay, so immediately this issue of reproduction, right, and this ability to compete and control is developed through kind of women. So arguments people will make is like, oh, you know, tribes will argue with each other because they're competing over women, and political power is represented through the kind of movement of women from tribe to tribe. Okay, now that's crazy, right? That's obviously a patriarchy, right? And there's no kind of like way to say that that is a natural thing. Okay, and obviously the work that we looked at previously with Lugonis also breaks that down a lot. So if you want to go back to that, I recommend going back to that. Okay, all right, so this is McClintock again. All too often in male nationalisms, gender difference between women and men serves to symbolically define the limits of national difference and power between men. Okay, so the power of a nation, according to the kind of mainstream political discourse, right, of imagined community, is that the gender difference between women and men symbolically that defines the limits of national difference and power between men. Okay, so women are typically construed as the symbolic bearers of the nation, but are denied any direct relation to national agency. So nationalism is thus constituted from the very beginning as a gender discourse and cannot be understood without a theory of gender power. So nationalism is a feminist issue, right? So that's something I talked about in my long lecture on Ang Lee and epistolary feminism. So I talked a bit about that. But like a movie like Mother India, right? So Mother India is made at this very, very crucial time in the Republic of India, you know, that history. It's in the 1950s, right? They already went through partition. It's a very scary time. And politically, they need to unite India to make it seem as like a coherent whole, right? The nation must be kind of protected, right? So one of the ways that they do this is through the culture industry. So the culture industry promotes a notion of nationhood, of India as a nation, right? But what is that movie about? So any of you who did get to watch Mother India is all about the sufferings of this mother in this tribe, right? So it's about associating the sufferings of that mother, the symbolism, you know, she serves as an allegory of the nation. And, you know, what happens to her and her kind of virtue and goodness, despite the bad things that have happened, represent a sort of way of symbolizing the power of India. Okay, so one of the things, okay, all right, so just something like this, women and the treatment of women and the ways that women are treated differently than men is a way to symbolize power between men. Okay. So nation is almost always inherently understood as one that's built around gender difference. You understand this point and why this is important to understand? Okay, so even in the construction of nation, you have gender understood as a way to understand the power of that nation and its ability to do things. Okay, all right. So another important critique that McClintock makes is that nationhood is always built on a common time. Okay, and this is and that's not just nation, but it's basically all of kind of what we call modernity, right? But this kind of practice of, you know, modernization is about being put on a sort of clock that everyone sort of agrees on. Okay, and that clock just happens to be in Europe, right, where where the colonizing empire is kind of created, right? But basically modernity creates a standard, right, and everyone joins into that, right? And so the nation is also a modern kind of concept, right? And the idea is that everyone in the nation is on the same time. So if you were in a village before, then you look at the sun, you're like, it's time to go to bed. It's time to wake up. It's time to go to breakfast. It's time to seed the crop, something like that, right? But then in modernity, you look at your watch, right? And it's 5 a.m. What does it mean at 5 a.m. for you, right? It's also 5 a.m. somewhere else, right? And so this idea is our unification is built around this idea of a time, a set time that we all kind of take part in, okay? And we learn that from media, right? We learn that from, you know, like, I know what time it is because I use my phone. My phone kind of mediates time for me, and I see myself as in line with that, as part of modernity. It's part of the modern, right? So part of nations modernizing, right? One was, through things like decolonization, is that they start to institute, obviously, like a national time, okay? That everyone's supposed to follow. Everyone's supposed to be on the same clock, okay? And in order for a nation, part of the story of the nation then is the nation is always about progress. Why do we work together? Why do we form a group? It's because we want to benefit ourselves. We want to improve, right? We want to progress. We want to move, this is key, into the future, okay? However, there's a temporal paradox of this, right? So nation defines itself as progressive, future-oriented, and teleological. So teleological means, telos means that you're moving in a progressive way, going towards some sort of ending that's good, okay? So any idea of a nation is always built around the notion of a utopia that you're heading towards, okay? You're progressing towards that utopia, that perfectness. Okay, so it's always future-oriented and teleological, but it needs to identify antiquity. So this is key. How do you know you're going forward? Right? How do you know that you're going forward? So let's say you're sleeping on a train and you wake up and you don't look out the window. Do you know if you're stopping or going? How do you know? You need to have some sort of reference for the thing that you're moving away from. So if I look out the window and suddenly a tree zooms by and it's like, yeah, I'm moving forward, because I see the tree moving backwards, right? Okay, so the notion of a national time means not only that you have a future, a utopia, or whatever that you're progressing towards, but it also means that there's an antiquity, an ancient, something behind that you're moving away from, in order to understand yourself as part of a nation, moving away from a tradition and towards something new and progressive. Okay, nationalism is built around this progressive kind of teleology. Okay, so that's why a lot of modern nations incorporate some notion of antiquity or the past into it. So obviously with the PRC, there's always this kind of notion that, oh, we represent Chinese civilization, which goes back 3,000 years. Okay, which is like, okay, that's like saying there's such thing as a European civilization. Okay, right? So it's like, however, by claiming that, then they have this kind of way of saying that, but we are the moving forward. We are the progressive group. We are the ones who are taking the nation away from that past and moving it forward, right? You know, Mao with his Cultural Revolution, right? We need to leave behind Confucianism. We need to leave that behind and progress towards the utopia. So this is why many of these modern nations reference the old in their work. Even the word China, you can think of it as a reference to an antiquity. Okay, so whether it's a People's Republic of China or a Republic of China, the idea is this is the progress from that antiquity. So same examples in Germany, right, with like Hitler's Third Reich, right? So what was the First Reich? What was the Second Reich, right? He's always trying to reference something in antiquity to demonstrate his progressive forward. The Khmer Rouge, okay, so Khmer is the language and also an empire, the Khmer Empire in Cambodia. But then rouge in French, right, means red, right? So the Khmer Rouge was the Cambodian Communist Party. So there's a reference to antiquity, but a reference to the modern progress, okay? From Hindustan to Republic of India, like I said, ancient Chinese civilization to ROC, PRC, even Malaysia, there's always trying to build on what we're moving away from in order to construct our nation, okay? We work together because we want to be different from that, okay? However, there's a contradiction, right? That you have a nostalgia for a past and a push towards a future, and it has to be managed. Okay, how do you manage that? And McClintock argues you manage that through relational metaphor of family gender roles. Okay, the old and the new. So how do people, make sense of, temporal difference, but also kind of difference in progress, right? They look to, at least the argument McClintock is making, is that people inevitably build that around notions of the family. So father is progress, mother is the past. Father modernizes, mother reminds us of what is good with tradition. Okay, so this contradiction and this marriage, right? How do you marry, right? This is the term I'm going to use, right? How do you marry the past and the present, or the future and the past? So a word like Khmer Rouge, right? How do you marry that together and say we still belong together as a unity, even though this is the thing that's gone or we don't need anymore? And it's managed through the notion of a relationship like family. So women are considered the past, right? It's frozen in time of antiquity, right? Natural or biological, a physical body of the nation, like atavistic, like an avatar of the nation, but not actually in control. Or even the body of the nation, right? So like Mother India. India itself is symbolized within the body of the woman, right? And so, you know, Indian people need to do a really good job of taking care of the nation, because that's like taking care of the mother. But at the same time, the mother doesn't do anything, right? She just suffers, right? Okay? So they're seen as the object that needs to be taken care of and understood and loved, okay? But the men are constituted as the future, the temporal progress of history. So civilization, technological advance, the mind of the nation. So it's up to the men to make sure that the women are taken care of, protected, okay? But men are seen as the agent. So nationhood itself is gendered, according to McClintock's critique, okay? Any questions right now about McClintock's critique of gender? Critique of nationhood through the lens of gender?
Just that seems to overlap with Pateman's idea around the sexual contract.
Oh, I'm not familiar with it. Do you want to share?
Okay, that's right. So Pateman is this political theorist who has this idea that the social contract, as it was conceived as like these men coming together in the clearing of the forest and like, you know, forming societies, ignores from the very beginning that the women are at home, you know, cooking the dinner. Yeah. Like as a simplification.
Okay, yeah.
But that in the original construction of the nation, women are left out.
Yeah.
You know, deliberately.
Yes, yes.
And it's just seen as, oh yes, the men are building it up and doing all these things, but really there's a whole thing that they've missed when you look at it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, basically you do need to rethink. Well, I think all ways of thinking about nationhood or political community needs to be rethought, needs to be rethought always. Okay. But anyway, this is rethinking it just through lens of gender. Okay. But anyway, let's keep going. All right. Okay. So, okay. And so the problems that McClintock's pointing out is like, when you think about, you know, when you use this kind of mindset and consider that gender is completely normalized, think that gender is a natural way to organize knowledge, then it becomes problematic in these kind of ways, right? So for McClintock, she argues that it naturalizes family and makes it ahistorical. So it doesn't, if you think about it, right, what makes a certain type of family the right normal way of being a family, right? So like, let's say Freud, right? Freud says that, oh, you know, in a regular family, you have a mother, a father, and a son. And there's this Oedipus complex that all the sons go through, right? Because of this formation of mother, father, son. And the son desires authority and power, and it covets the mother and wants to kill the father, right? And that's just a normal political situation because of this arrangement, and that's normal, right? But what if most people don't live like mother, father, daughter? You know, what if people live in like compounds, you know, where there's like a village and you have uncles and aunties and, you know, like lots of different other living factors, and you have, you know, older siblings and cousins all living together and taking care of each other. This doesn't fit Freud's model, right? And yet at the same time, if you think of nation as kind of, and gender as completely natural, then it takes away the historical factors that shape these kind of familial structures. So the argument is that actually familial structures are themselves historical, right? They are influenced in these many different ways, right? It's not necessarily natural to have it one way or another. But if you think that the concept of nation is something that must be held onto strictly, then that means that all the things that are justifying it, right, which is a family structure, is then naturalized and taken for granted. So if you take it for granted, then that means that it cannot change either. So that means that something like a patriarchal heterosexual family construction becomes the dominant norm, and it does not get questioned because you don't want to question something like nationhood. So that means that our political unity is contingent upon the kind of maintenance of a certain type of family structure. Okay, so anyway, so that's just how this kind of it forms, shapes. Okay, so these are the problems. Family, or all sociality, really, right? Any form of socialization is structured by nationhood. Okay, And it's all historical. It actually is contingent upon what happens. So we subsume time and nation into a supposedly natural relation as defined by family, gender relation. But the conceptualization of nation actually generates and reinforces those gender roles. More importantly, we begin to assume the naturalness of that particular social system because it enforces our ideological beliefs about nationhood. So one of the discussion questions I might have is like, how might this process of subjectification or interpolation actually play a role in other political movements, including feminism or third world feminism? Okay. All right. So one example of this, and I think if any of you want to write papers about this, is quite interesting, is imagine if you have a new formation of nation. One of those might be like Hong Konger, and you see Hong Konger as something that's a different nation. Right? And when I say nation, I don't mean recognized by the UN. I just mean kind of what you think of as your imagined community, okay? And you know, as a political organ, right? So what if people are forming one called Hong Konger, right? But then if that Hong Konger is already imbued with a sort of notion of nationhood that takes gender for granted, then isn't that nation always inevitably going to end up being kind of gendered and discriminatory in certain ways? So one thing that people are talking about then is how even political movements in Hong Kong for example, like, you know, more kind of political autonomy, for example, like oftentimes will ignore gender issues and then say, oh, we need to ignore this because the movement for Hong Kongers comes first before gender. Okay, so you can see how even in contemporary political movements, something like gender will say, oh, that's not as important as, you know, forming ourselves as a political community in support of Hong Kong. Okay, so this is the way that kind of works. All right, cool. I feel like that was quite a lot. Do you all want to take a break? No, you want to keep going? Okay, can I see a hand raised? Who wants to take a break? Who wants to keep going? You can say in the chat, or you can raise your hand. Keep going. Keep going. Okay. All right, everyone wants to keep going? Oh, okay, just let me check. Okay, Alice, sorry, did you mean keep going as in you want to raise your hand to keep going, or you raise your hand to, okay, keep going. All right, okay, just give me a second. Okay. All right, Mohanty, let's do it. So the important terms in Mohanty's cartographies of struggle, okay, is this term third world women, okay? So third world women is an intersectional term, okay? But even the term itself, it has a lot of things that go into that term as well, right? So women, we can think of that as a social category. But what is third world? Okay, so this notion of third world might not make much sense to many of you millennials, but third world is originally constructed as a kind of alternative to what many at the time considered first world and second world, which was basically the Euro-American capitalist kind of bloc, including NATO and its allies, and then the Soviet republics, USSR, and the kind of communist system. So this was seen as the first world and the second world, and they were kind of competing with each other, right? And then there was what was called the Third World Liberation Front. So there were groups of nations, right, who saw themselves as non-affiliated or third world of the first two, okay? And they were often seen as the differentiator used, okay, by colonizers to demonstrate their power over each other, okay? So remember, the Soviets, right, USSR, and the United States are both basically the dominant colonizing empires after World War II. They're doing their colonialism in different places. USSR is in Afghanistan, right? The United States is in Vietnam. Okay, so you have these different forms of imperialism and colonialism going on. And then you have these other groups who are saying, hey, you know, I'm not second world. I'm not part of the USSR bloc, because if I join their bloc, they're going to assimilate and colonize me. But I'm not part of the American capitalist bloc either, because if I incorporate with them, they're going to interpolate, assimilate, and, you know, colonize me too. So we want to be part of this third world liberation front, okay? So this is the idea of a third world. And this also rose up in the 60s and the 70s, along with civil rights movements in the United States and other places, right? So a lot of people thought of themselves as aligned with the third world. So Mohanty's saying then, actually, this notion of third world needs something else appended to that, which is women. Because a third world person is not the same thing as a third world woman, right? So already that's already thought of. But really her kind of critique is actually aimed at feminism, because you can't think about women's struggles as the same thing as third world women's struggles. So it's a sort of intersectional term, because the things that people are dealing with in, women are dealing with in third world places. And even then, this notion of third world's really problematic, right? Today you'll hear people say OECD countries and developing or emerging economies, right? So the language around this is constantly changing. But the point is that when Mohanty was writing in the 90s, this term third world women seemed to kind of make sense, right? So the third world is defined through geographical location, as well as particular socio-historical conjunctures. It thus incorporates so-called minority peoples or people of color in the USA. So even though you are a citizen of the United States of America, you might still also be considered third world because of the way you are mistreated in America. Understood? Okay. So Mohanty's arguing that you have a political rather than biological or cultural basis for alliance. Okay. Thus, it is not color or sex that constructs the grounds for these struggles. Rather, it is the way we think about race, class, and gender, the political links we choose to make among and between struggles. Thus, potentially women of all colors, including white women, can align themselves with and participate in these imagined communities. Okay, so she's asking for a different way to envision imagined community as one as unified with those who are struggling. So there is a bit of, socialists of the world unite kind of sense of that too, right? Sort of solidarity with that as well, right? So it's like, how do you shape your solidarity, right? And so she's saying third world women can shape their solidarity together, and even feminists can be part of that struggle. Okay, so the book that this came from is actually, the book is called Cartographies of Struggle, because the book basically has an edited volume, a really important edited volume, goes through the map and looks at different examples of struggles around the world, okay, and draws attention to that and saying that, yes, if you conceive of yourself politically first, then you can also conceive of yourself as taking part in this struggle. All right, so that was very short, but really the big thing about Mohanty's Cartographies of Struggle is that you should go into the book and read the specific case studies. So for the rest of this semester, what I've been asking for you in this course, 2001, De-colonizing Gender, is to start deciding what case studies and examples you want to read now on your own. So if you choose to focus on Hong Kong, you choose to focus on Southeast Asia, you choose to focus on other concepts or other ways of thinking about, like queer sinophone or transgender or decolonizing transgender. These are different topics you can kind of branch into on your own. But I've kind of tried to record and make sure we have all the theory necessary, so then you can start making your decisions about where you want to go and study and what you want to study about. Understand? Okay, so your midterm is done, but your final, I want you to choose one of those legs, right? Like choose your own adventure and study up on it, okay? And then kind of come up with something interesting or an argument to make or a discussion you want to have about that, okay? So any questions about where we're at now? Okay, cool. All right, so I'm going to go over one more very, very important reading. So, and the reason why I kind of want to stop here and end with this is because it's really important for you to kind of start doing your own work and not have your sort of knowledge come from me, right? You need to kind of read for yourselves, learn for yourselves, and speak for yourselves, especially if you really think of it as, decolonizing gender requires that you also, once you deconstruct the notion of gender and the notion of nation and how they're related to each other, then what kind of work are you going to do afterwards to construct, to understand on your own, to build on your own? And I'm telling you, as an instructor, and this is from the first lesson, right? As an instructor, but also part of the colonial apparatus of the University of Hong Kong, right? And the English language, that in order for it to be really decolonizing, you also need to start doing work on your own and researching on your own and building new discourses on your own that is of your agency. Okay, you need to become subject. You need to become, student, scholar, researcher who kind of comes up with these ideas that allows for new ideas of political community, political identity, right? Subjecthood, okay? So that's an exciting time. It's time for you to grow. But the last critique that remains, right, is one that kind of Spivak offers about can the subaltern speak, okay? So when we are doing something, like let's say we're saying it's like, yeah, you know, third wave women, third wave feminism, you know, kind of, I want to associate with that, right? And I want to speak up for those who are not speaking, right? But the very strong critique that Spivak makes, right, is that those who really, really need to be spoken for cannot speak themselves, which means that anytime we claim to speak for them, we are asserting our authority over them. And yet, we also must maintain and understand that the subaltern exists. The subaltern is not a fiction of imagination. The subaltern actually exists, but cannot speak. So that means, and especially in our sort of Western Enlightenment kind of belief system, who is a subject? What makes someone a subject? What makes someone that they are granted things like rights, the ability, the right to health, right to life? Okay, I guarantee you right now during this COVID-19 pandemic, there are people who are suffering the most, okay, from something like a global public health emergency are the ones who cannot get on Twitter and tell people they're suffering. The ones who cannot go to their local, their local government and be like, hey, I need surgical masks. Even in Hong Kong, the people who are really having the biggest problems, the most subaltern, they cannot speak. They don't have that ability to speak because by definition, there is a bottom of that totem pole. The kind of actual non-subject who still has a body, right? The actual non-subject that cannot speak, that is being not provided for, okay? So Spivak's attack then, and this is important to understand about Gayatri Spivak, is Spivak was one of the first to translate Derrida from French into English, okay? So she's a postcolonial scholar, feminist, but also part of that critical theory tradition, right? She's understood as someone who advanced critical theory around the world, okay? But at the same time, her very, very famous essay, Can the Subaltern Speak, is very, very critical of the critical theory tradition, critical of the critical, yeah, all right? So what I would say is, and some people agree, disagree, and I love, if someone knows more about this, like you all, like, feel free to teach me, okay? All right, but the way I interpret Spivak is this, is that Spivak is making a critique of this idea of subjectlessness, right? The subjectless critique, right? The idea that, there's no such thing as anything essential. There's no essentialism, right? So we've already broken down gender in this class, right? Let's say we break down nation. Let's say you break down race, right? You deconstruct all of them. You realize all of them are based on things like language, okay? All of them, and remember, we also think that language itself is already gendered, right? So what does that mean then about individuality or your subjecthood? Can you be a subject? What makes you a subject, okay? And so the argument then, right, especially extending onto enlightenment, and Sam, maybe you can help me out with this, right? But the idea is that what makes you a subject is your ability to speak, okay? You get your ability to represent yourself is what gains you representation, okay? And representation is all about how kind of politics work, right? So for example, right, let's say like when we play Mafia, right? You have the townspeople and the Mafia, right? the Mafia have the most power because they can speak in the public session, but they also get to speak at night, right? They wake up at night, and those of you who don't understand, I'm talking about Mafia, the party game, okay? But the Mafia have the ability to speak at night and during the day to influence the outcome of the situation. Now, but there also are subaltern, right? The dead cannot speak at all. No speaking, right? Okay, that's the rules, right? But does that mean that the dead do not exist? Right? So even when we understand what makes something a subject is that they can make themselves subject by speaking, by engaging in the discourse, in that conversation, the fact remains that there are those who cannot speak and will always be unable to speak, okay? And we cannot ever claim to speak for them because that's obviously not true, okay? All right, so this is a sort of contradiction that points to a certain kind of truth, I think that is what Spivak is trying to say. So Spivak always does deconstruction, right? But deconstruction doesn't mean that you strip everything of meaning and say that, oh, it's just meaningless. No, the point of deconstruction is to identify what actually creates that meaning, what generates that meaning, okay? So the point of subalternity, right, is what it really demonstrates is that, oh, it's not that, oh, there's people whose lives are, you know, so bad that they're the bottom of the totem pole and we have to protect them. No, it's that, yes, they exist, but they're also unprotectable because they cannot speak, so you cannot claim to know what's going on with them. And yet the subaltern is the sort of way that we understand ourselves as subjects. The fact that we can speak is what sort of enables us to be speakers. But remember when we were talking about nation before, right? It needs to be defined against the other, the subaltern, the non-speaking, okay? And that's what deconstruction does. It shows you the relationships between the concepts that actually produces the meaning. So deconstruction does not make it meaningless. Deconstruction allows you to see what gives value to its meaning and how it creates meaning, okay? So don't ever let anyone tell you deconstruction is meaningless, okay? All right, and that's also true of like fake news, right? It's like the point of deconstruction is not to say all news is fake. It's to kind of get you critically thinking through an exercise to understand what makes news news, what makes it real, right? And then you have to investigate and understand things like journalism and how truth is constructed in journalism, okay? So deconstruction allows you to understand construction. And the big problem is not that, you know, everything gets deconstructed. The big problem is that we take for granted that things are natural and not constructed. And there's problems with that. That leads to these kind of mores and models for, you know, like the norms that we consider a society that can become quite oppressive. Okay. Let's see. So, all right, so let's just go into the text, right? So basically, when critical theorists, right, like Deleuze and Foucault, and don't get me wrong, these are like my two favorite theorists all time, right? But Spivak is saying is like, if theorists like Deleuze and Foucault and Guattari, argue that there's no essential sovereign subject, then they reify one by implication. So if you're saying there's no such thing as a real subject, then you're saying then the only real subjects are those who speak. Okay, right? If I say there's no such thing as a real subject, like a, you know, an essence or a soul of a person, there's no soul. You can be like that, okay? We can go back to religious terminology. The critical theorists would say there's no such thing as a soul. There's no essence of a person. So what makes a person is speaking. And by speaking, you make a speaker. Okay? So what comes first though, the speaker or the speaking? The critical theorists would say that the speaking is what creates the speaker. Okay? But then Spivak is saying, well, then what are you saying then? You're saying that those who cannot speak do not exist, but they do, right? And so that's why it's a very important thing to point out, okay? So Spivak argues that when you say that all subjects are, created through speaking, right? It's a form of epistemic violence. So episteme, right, that's a Foucauldian term, means knowledge, okay, or a sort of system of knowledge, right? So discourse, right, if you say like discourse is like a system of knowledge with its own sort of value systems built into it, right? That Spivak says is if you have this value system, right, and we've talked about value systems, right, like coloniality, we've talked about value systems like, you know, obviously patriarchy, right, you know, but even class or colonialism, right? If you have a sort of system, right, that enforces certain norms, then it can be violent, okay? Because the system of its language enforces certain rules. And by enforcing those specific kinds of rules, it crushes those who are subject to those rules. So if you say then that according to our system of knowledge, there's no such thing as an actual subject, and all you have is speaking, and speaking creates the subjects, then those who cannot speak automatically are basically taken out of the picture, assumed to not exist. And so Spivak's saying is this is a form of epistemic, right? So this system, violence, an enforcement of epistemic violence, right? And this is largely the arguments that people say about political inclusion when it comes to language, right? When you don't use inclusive language, then you're saying that those who are not included do not exist, are not of value, and also takes away their ability to participate. Okay, so that is a form of violence, epistemic violence. Okay, so, but this is what Spivak is saying, is the very condition of being incapable of speech makes subalternity as a category. The subaltern cannot speak. So being oppressed is not the same as being subaltern. You can speak, but also be oppressed at the same time. It's not binary, right? So what are the implications of this? The ethical implications, the historical implications, the theoretical, the postcolonial. There's many, many implications of this kind of critique of the subjectless, the critique of subjectlessness, okay? Or what people, and remember, okay, so for people who do kind of philosophy, Deleuze, Foucault, right? They're critiquing Descartes and the mind-body split, saying that there's such thing as the mind. They're saying, no, there is no mind, there's just speaking, right? But then Spivak is saying there are those who cannot speak that have a body, right? So that's an important thing to distinguish, okay? All right, so there's a lot of really important implications of this, but I'm just gonna go over some of Spivak's kind of main example that she gives, all right? So Spivak has an example of sati. So sati, and she also deconstructs the term sati, okay? And it doesn't mean the same thing in English as it does in, you know, Hindi or in other languages. And even then it's been translated many, many times. So she's saying the word sati itself is historical, okay? But I'm talking about sati, the way it's understood today, you know, after British colonialism, as a sort of ritual, okay? So this is the ritual as described by the normalization of British knowledge around the world. Okay, so this is Spivak. This this Hindu widow ascends the pyre of the dead husband and immolates herself upon it. So basically, part of the discourse is that there's a traditional ceremony where Hindu women whose husband dies, after the husband gets put onto a funeral pyre, you know, the dead body, they then commit the act of sati. So they throw themselves on the pyre and burn themselves alive too, because they can't stand to live without the husband, okay? So this is widow sacrifice. So, and then she breaks it down. The conventional transcription of the Sanskrit word for the widow would be sati. The early colonial British transcribed it as sati. The rite was not practiced universally and was not caste or class fixed. The abolition of this rite by the British has been generally understood as a case of white men saving brown women from brown men. White women from the 19th century British missionary registers to Mary Daly have not produced an alternative understanding. Against this is the nativist argument, a parody of nostalgia for lost origins. The women actually wanted to die. So think of the politics of this situation, all right? You've got this practice that's not everywhere, and it's not just rich people do it or just poor people who do it. It's not just people of certain castes that do it. It happens, but it doesn't happen uniformly or fixedly. The British colonials come in, and the British colonials are like, look at this barbarism. Can you believe this? The Hindu men force the Hindu women to burn themselves alive, right? To be with their men, right? And so we need to save these brown women from these brown men by creating a law that says you're not allowed to do this. That's terrible, right? You could think of this as similar as, you know, a white Christian missionary impulse in like China, for example, right? It's like, you know, people went to missionaries went to Qing China and like, wow, this is terrible. They forced these women to bind their feet. This is barbarism. If the British take over here, they would outlaw it, okay? All right, so this is seen as like, oh, you know, this could be seen as a feminist action, right? You're protecting women. Arguments when the U.S. went into Afghanistan is that, you know, I can't believe this is like 20 years ago now, you know, 19 years ago. So before some of you were born, the U.S. went into Afghanistan because the Taliban was a misogynist group. And it is misogynist. It does terrible things. But that's seen as a justification for colonialism. You see how that's different? It's different from saying like, oh, you know, we want to help them because that's terrible. From we're going to take over because they treat their women poorly. So you see how women are created as this sort of symbol of power between men, okay? So Spivak says there's this one hand is the white colonizers saying, oh, we're being feminist. We're protecting women, right? And then there's the nativists, right, who are like anti-colonial, who are saying the women actually wanted to die, right? So it's like you have these two sentences that are crazy. One sentence is, we're going to save brown women from brown men, as if being with a white man, is so much better, right? But at the same time, the other is like, the brown man's like, no, they want to do that. They love their religion, they love their nation, and they love their men, and they choose to do that. And this a modern incarnation of this argument that's very convoluted, right? And I don't have a clear position on it either way, and I find it very confusing, is the issue of the hijab, right? Many women will be like, no, that's patriarchy. But then other, maybe women who wear hijab might be like, hey, it's my right to wear the hijab, right? And then you could have places where men make women wear hijab who are like, actually, the women want to wear hijab, okay? So in between these two spaces, can the people who are being forced to do these things actually speak up? So you have brown men, okay, and using that terminology, brown men saying, I know what's best for brown women. You have white men saying, I know what's best for brown women. But the brown woman is not speaking. That's the point, okay? And yet that brown woman is made into the symbol of the relationship between these two and their power struggle with each other, okay? The point is that as these two struggle, this third and the subaltern, and remember, we're all built in different layers, right? Because we're all intersectional. We might be oppressed in some ways, but privileged in others, right? But we all speak. But the subaltern, the one that everyone's saying is what this is really about, the passive agent, cannot speak, but still experiences, still is affected, okay? So this is what Spivak says. These two sentences go a long way to legitimize each other. One never encounters the testimony of the women's voice consciousness, right? You never hear what the woman says. Such a testimony would not be ideology transcendent, okay? So yes, it would have an ideological sway. It would be influenced by whatever it is that's being kind of placed on that person, okay? It's not ideology transcendent. It's not separate from ideology. It's not fully subjective, or of course, but it would have constituted the ingredients for producing a counter sentence. So there is a resistance to these, right? This subaltern category creates a resistance, but not in a way that our current value system of understanding can explain. Does that make sense? Did I lose everyone? You all there? No? You got it. Okay, cool. All right. So then this comes down to this issue of unrepresentability. And I'm emphasizing this to you because as you read these different texts about, like, let's say you focus on Hong Kong, you focus on China, you focus on Japan, you focus on Cambodia, whatever, even as you're reading it, you cannot think that that is representation. And even though those texts may be written by scholars who live there, they themselves are still not subaltern, right? Because they're speaking, right? So there's always another kind of level of unrepresentability that you cannot take for granted, or else you also take part in that epistemic violence. So this is what she says. Between patriarchy and imperialism, subject constitution and object formation, right? So subject constitution, object formation, right? Patriarchy and imperialism, these different intersectional forces, the figure of the woman disappears. Not into a pristine nothingness, but into a violent shuttling, which is the displaced figuration of a third world woman caught between tradition and modernization, being used between these, okay? The subaltern cannot speak. There's no virtue in global laundry lists with woman as a pious item. Representation is not withered away. The female intellectual, as intellectual, has a circumscribed task which she must not disown with a flourish. Okay, so this is her call to arms. Okay, and this is quite interesting. So basically, Spivak is saying, and she's also been cited later as arguing for what she calls the strategic essentialism. She's saying that women intellectuals, even though there's no such thing as essentialism, there's no real essentialist spirit. Really, there's no such thing as the category of women that is not separate from history, that is not socially constructed. At the same time, because you are socially constructed as a female intellectual, you have a responsibility to stand up and argue and look for and seek out the subaltern. It's strange, but it's like, as someone who understands that nothing is essential, you have a responsibility to essentialize for the something that you can never speak for, but to know that it's there. So you cannot speak for the subaltern, but you must know that it exists. And you have a responsibility to not disown that. If you, as a feminist or female intellectual, right, says there's no such thing as a subject, there's no such thing as the category women, right, then you're erasing everything. And if you erase everything, then you take away the fact that then you violate the people who are actually being, oppressed in some certain way. So that's the problem. Another way to think about this is like, let's say you have this notion of fake news, right? So it's like, oh, you can't trust the news because it's all fake, right? If you do that, then you lose everything when it comes to news, right? If you say all news is fake, then you lose everything that has to come with news. It's like erasing everything. And when you erase everything, what are you left with but what the things people consider to be natural? And what the things people consider to be natural is always going to be the status quo. Because if you can't have any new news, then what is remains the same. Understand? Okay. So that's why it's important to understand representability, to understand that you have a responsibility to look for what is not being represented, but also to acknowledge that you can never represent it. Got it? Okay, cool. So that's Spivak. And I've never taught that before, so I'm pretty glad that we were able to do that. So I'm glad I have a group of very smart students to help me understand it. All right, so y'all ready for questions? Okay, all right, so I'm gonna turn off the screen share, okay? And let's go back to gallery view. Okay, so questions, comments, feedback? Still digesting. Still there? Okay. I don't know. Maybe should I stop recording, or would you feel better if I stop recording? Would you be able to ask more questions? Okay. All right. That's what I'm gonna
go on.
Okay. All right. I'll stop recording. Okay. And then you feel free. Okay. All right. So that's the end of this. All right. Okay. I'm gonna stop that, and then we'll post that for your classmates.